Now that you know the basics of CSS layout, and you've built the layout for a simple web page, it's time to learn another useful CSS layout technique: positioning elements with relative, absolute, and fixed positioning. The CSS position property gives you even more precise control over your page layout. CSS positioning makes it easy to place elements, like a menu or an icon, anywhere on the page. You can add text captions over images and make sure your navigation stays at the top of the page, even when your users scroll down the page. So coming up in this section of the course, you'll learn how CSS positioning works. Then you'll use those skills to enhance parts of the Best City Guide layout. First, I'm going to show you a simple example of how absolute positioning works. You can follow along by launching the workspace on this page. So this is a simple vertical menu. All items are nested inside the UL with the class main_nav, and some list items have classes like ice cream and tea. Back in the browser preview, the area with the turquoise background color is the containing main header div. And the light gray area you see is the body of the page. I simply gave the body a light gray background color in the CSS. So I'm going to target the list item with the class ice cream, which is the first item in the list. Back in my CSS, I'll scroll down to the position styles, and notice what happens when I give the list item with the class ice cream a position property and the value absolute. When I refresh the browser, the top ice cream item is taken out of the normal flow of the list and placed in the top left corner of the parent UL element. And the other list items no longer honor the original space of the top ice cream item. In fact, if I resize the browser window, notice how it's positioned above the content. It's like the other content on the page doesn't even know this positioned element exists. This is the natural behavior of elements positioned absolute. You see, elements with absolute positioning are neither affected by or do not affect other elements in the normal flow of the page. They're like layers in Photoshop or Illustrator. You're free to place them anywhere you wish on the page. But they do rely you telling the browser where to place the element using values called positioning offsets for the element's top, right, bottom, or left position. Back in the CSS, I'm going to give the ice cream list item a top offset using the top property, and I'm going to set the value to 0. Then I'll add a left offset with the left property, and I'll set the value to 0 as well. So when I save my style sheet and refresh the page, notice how the list item is now placed in the top left corner of the browser window. You can place an element anywhere on the page using the positioning offsets top, right, bottom, and left, but you don't need to use all 4 of these offsets. Here, I'm only using 2 offsets, but you could also use just 1 offset. So let's try 2 other offset values. I'll change the top offset from 0 to 100 pixels, and I'll make the left offset 50 pixels. So back in the browser preview, when I refresh the page, you can see how the offsets moves the list items 100 pixels away from the top edge of the page and 50 pixels away from the left edge. So now let's try positioning the list item with the class T. Back in my style sheet, I'll give the list item with the class T a position property, and I'll set the value to absolute. Then I'll give it a right offset of 0 and a bottom offset of 0. So when we refresh the page, notice how it shifts the list item over to the bottom right corner of the page. You can also use percentage and M values as offsets. So for example, back in my T rule, I'll change the right offset value to 6M and the bottom offset value to 50%. These offsets move the list item 6M or 96 pixels away from the right edge of the page and 50% away from the bottom edge. When you use absolute positioning, you place the absolutely positioned elements in relation to a parent container. And the parent container is the positioning context. Currently, the positioning context of the list items is the browser viewport. So any offset values defined places the elements in relation to the edges of the browser. But the positioning context can be changed to other containing elements, like main header or main nav. This lets us position elements precisely where we want them. In the next video, you'll learn how to change the positioning context with relative positioning.